This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm going to talk to you today about 5 paintings. And the first is Botticelli's Primavera. And then we're going to talk about a painting by Titian. Then we're going to look at a fresco cycle in Rome. And finally, 2 paintings, one by Poussin, one by Rubens. The topic of the lecture is how the old masters read the classics. And if you take one thing back from this lecture, it should be that the old masters never simply illustrated a text. They engaged with it, they read it closely, and they interpreted it through their picture. You might even argue that the picture is a reading of the text as profound as the text itself. So let's see how this works. How did these painters engage with the classics? I'm starting with this painting by Botticelli. It's one of the most canonical works of the Renaissance. It was painted between 1477 and 1478 for one of the most powerful men in Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo de' Medici was also a great supporter of the humanist project, the revival of ancient letters, indeed of every aspect of ancient culture. Botticelli painted for him a new kind of picture. It was called a favola, and that translates mythological fiction. The principle that undergirds this kind of picture is in Latin, ut pictura poesis. As is a picture, so is a poem, but it was also construed to mean as is a poem, so is a picture. Botticelli is trying to prove to us that his powers of poetic invention are as great as those of the ancient authors he consulted in devising his favola, his mythological fiction. The function of the picture is not only to tell a story, but also to incorporate an effictio, the description of physical beauty. And this is a rhetorical term that is applied very often to lyric poetry. The description of beauty is one of the great effects that lyric poets can produce. And so what does Botticelli do? He paints a favola that incorporates the effigies of beautiful women and also beautiful men. Oops, I seem to have to control this from the podium. Now, who are these characters? Let's start from the right and move to the left. And I'm just going to identify them for you. And then I'm going to show you what Botticelli is doing with the texts from which he drew these characters. Starting on the right, we have the god of the west wind. His name is Zephyr. Zephyr. He abducts the nymph of the bare earth, and her name is Chloris. So this is Chloris over here, and inseminates her. The west wind inseminates the bare earth, and this is how spring is born, through the insemination of the earth by the west wind. So as he abducts her, so flowers begin to pour from her mouth, and she is transformed into the goddess Flora. So Chloris becomes the goddess of springtime gardens, the goddess of springtime verdancy, Flora. Presiding over this event is Venus. And above Venus, we see her son, Cupid, the god of love. To Venus's right, we have 3 goddesses celebrating the coming of spring, bodied forth through the insemination of Chloris by Zephyr and her transformation into Flora. These are the 3 graces. And next to the 3 graces, we have the god Mercury. Now, this is a very strange form of the god Mercury. What's he doing? With his wand, he's stirring the clouds. And so we see clouds over here. And from the clouds comes a gentle rain of seeds that pour down upon the earth. And it's very, very hard to see this here, but when you go and you look at the painting, and I hope one day you go to Florence and see this painting, you'll see little seeds pouring from the clouds and gathering at the feet of Mercury. Now, what are the texts that Botticelli consulted? First of all, he consulted Lucretius's philosophical poem on the nature of things. And he looked closely at chapter 5. And in chapter 5, Lucretius describes a pageant, a procession of gods who ceremonially welcome the coming of spring. And Lucretius says, in this procession, there was Zephyr and Flora, Venus and Cupid. Botticelli then went to one of Ovid's great poems, the Fasti, the festivals, and in chapter 5, he found a description of the festival sacred to the goddess Flora. And there he read that Flora was originally the nymph Chloris. It was when Flora was, as Chloris, was married to Zephyr that she became Flora. And so Botticelli uses Ovid to read Lucretius. In a way, he uses Ovid to gloss Lucretius. What Lucretius describes, Botticelli turns into a narrative of the birth of springtime verdancy. And so too, to the right of Venus, the three Graces and Mercury, Venus herself, he took from one of Horace's odes, and this is an ode in which Horace invokes Venus, invokes Mercury, invokes the Graces, and invokes Cupid, and asks them to visit his farm in the Sabine Hills outside Rome. And what Horace is doing is pleading with them to come and to bring with them spring and fertility to his estate, to his farm. Now, Botticelli, as he glossed Lucretius by way of Ovid, now glosses Horace by way of Seneca. And in Seneca's essay on benefits, there is a famous description of the three Graces. And Seneca describes them as personifications of benefits given and received. And what Seneca says, one of the Graces gives liberally to her sister. Her sister Grace receives with thanks. And her sister Grace gives in return to the giver. And so he describes a dance of the Graces as the dance of giving, receiving, and giving in return. And it is on the basis of Seneca's description of the dance of the Graces that Botticelli glossed Horace's poem invoking Venus, Cupid, the Graces, and Mercury. Mercury appears, as also do the Graces and Venus, as they're described in this famous text, Pausanias' description of Greece. And Pausanias tells us something very interesting about the version of the goddesses and gods depicted by Botticelli. For he says, when the Graces appear clothed, when Mercury appears with his, this is called a falx, F-A-L-X, this curious scimitar-like sword. And again, when Venus appears clothed, they are present in their oldest form. That is, this is a version of the gods and goddesses that was archaic even to the ancient Greeks. This is the gods as they were. So long ago, it can hardly be remembered. This is an archaic form of the gods and goddesses. Moreover, Venus, who is shown presiding over a lush and verdant garden filled with flowers and fruits as its presiding deity. Venus, who appears here as the goddess of verdant nature, as the goddess of springtime, is present in her most archaic manifestation. This is the age-old Venus, the goddess of spring, the goddess of verdancy, the goddess of fertility. This is Venus as she is described in this Roman poem on rustic things. And Columella describes the Venus who appears in Botticelli's painting, the Venus of fertility, the Venus of springtime. Venus, who is shown not nude, and this is usually how Venus is shown, but clothed. Moreover, Botticelli, in his description of the three graces, themselves clothed, also consulted Hesiod. Hesiod's poems, the Theogony, in which Hesiod says the graces in their archaic form, the age-old graces, appeared not nude, but clothed. So Botticelli reads Lucretius through Ovid. He reads Horace through Seneca. He reads Lucretius, Ovid, Horace, and Seneca through Columella, through Hesiod, through Pausanias. He doesn't simply consult and illustrate these texts. He turns them into what you might call an intertext. And he does this to produce a poetic invention as original, as rich as any poem of Ovid, any poem of Horace. Now, you're probably wondering why Botticelli, in producing this pictorial intertext, why he was so interested in the oldest form of the gods and goddesses. Not the form of Venus anyone would recognize, but an archaic form of Venus. Not the form of the Graces you and I would know if we were a Medici who had commissioned this painting, but an age-old form of the Graces. Why also he used an age-old form of Mercury. Mercury here, who functions as the god of the month of May. Mercury, when he is the god of the month of May, is shown with his falx, his wand, and he's shown stirring the clouds, causing a rain of seeds. Why is Botticelli so interested in these old forms of the gods and goddesses? Well, the answer is that he was interested in the meaning of Virgil's great Georgic, the second Georgic, in which Virgil, in the most beautiful language, describes not springtime, but the very first springtime ever. The very first springtime in the history of the seasons, in the history of the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of time. And this is what Botticelli was trying to show. He was trying to produce a favola, a mythological fiction, a pictorial poem about the very first springtime. Springtime over which the goddess Venus presides, a month that begins with the insemination of Chloris, her transformation into Flora. A month in which nature gives forth most bounteously, hence the presence of the gift-giving graces. A month that ends in the Roman rustic calendar on May 13th, that is in the month over which Mercury presides. In other words, what has Botticelli shown here? He's shown the progression of spring from the moment of its inception to its final day on May 13th, a month over which the goddess Venus, age-old goddess of gardens, verdancy, and fertility, is seen to preside. Clearly not an illustration of these texts, but a profoundly close reading of them for the purpose of producing a favola, a pictorial poem that vies with them in originality, in beauty of diction. Well, let's look at another of these images, this time by the painter Titian. And when Titian painted this picture in 1522 in Venice, the term favola had been replaced by the term poesia. And this is the Italian term for poem. And viewers of these images referred to them as picture poems, poesia, picture poems, which is a very interesting usage, and it shows how they looked at these images and thought of them as a pictorial poem. The subject here is the meeting of the god Bacchus, the god of wine, and the mortal woman Ariadne, who had been deserted by Theseus. So her paramour, Theseus, had abandoned her, and she was distraught. She was overcome by grief, by this loss of her lover. And as she was roaming distraught, she encountered the god Bacchus. What a coincidence, wouldn't we like, when we're not feeling happy, wouldn't we like to encounter the god Bacchus, who is returning triumphant from India. He's conquered the world with the gift of wine. He's made the world, he's turned the world into a population of wine drinkers, who therefore are his votaries, his devotees. And so this is his triumphal procession. And he encounters Ariadne, falls madly in love with her, and begs her, not commands, but entreats her to become his bride. And this is what Titian is showing us, the encounter of Bacchus and Ariadne. Like Botticelli, Titian based his picture not on a single textual source, but on a close reading of several, and three in particular. Let me first tell you the context of this picture. He was commissioned by the Lord of Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este, to paint a series of paintings for Alfonso's retiring chamber, his camerino. And this is the room to which Alfonso would retire to study works of literature, to take pleasure in works of art, to reflect on matters of importance, and to recreate. He commissioned Titian to paint a series of poesia, mythological fictions, for the walls of his camerino, and this is the first of Titian's contributions to this project. Titian, first of all, looked at Catullus's 64th lyric song, in which is described the triumphal train of Bacchus. It's a very complex poem, but embedded in the poem is a description of the furor of Bacchus's followers, the followers of Bacchus, how they celebrate the god, how in their devotion to their god, they tear animals limb from limb. And here you see that this satyr, he's half goat, half human. This satyr is holding up the thigh of a heifer. So they've torn this animal apart, and here you see a boy satyr dragging another animal part. Some of the followers are wreathed, this is what Catullus tells us, in serpents. His followers sing, they dance, they play on cymbals. And you see this nymph, Bacchante, a follower of Bacchus, a Bacchante, crashing these cymbals. In the back you can see other figures piping. This is Bacchus's most devoted follower, also his most debauched drinker. This is Silenus, who's toppling from the donkey's back. And on the back of this figure, you see the vessels that carry what Catullus says are the mysteries. And he doesn't tell us what these are. He simply calls them the mysteries, the cult objects that are shrouded, that are kept in vessels, that are sacred to the god and to the religion of Bacchus. And so we have this magnificent procession visualized by Titian. And what he's doing is he's showing that his pictorial power of inventive visualization is as great, is as vivid as the verbal power of visualization exemplified in Catullus's poem. What Catullus can do in poetic language, Titian shows he can do pictorially. Now, in Ovid's Art of Love, this is another poem by Ovid, the poet describes the encounter of Bacchus and Ariadne. He describes how Bacchus immediately, upon catching sight of Ariadne, falls in love with her. And the furor of his followers is nothing compared to the furor of his love of Ariadne. He leaps from his chariot, entreating Ariadne to become his spouse, and promises to glorify her celestially if she says yes. And this is why Titian has placed a crown of stars. It signifies the celestial glory that will come to Ariadne if she says yes. But Titian shows also what Ovid describes, how hesitant Ariadne is initially, how fearful she is of the god. And so what does Titian do? He shows her both looking intently at him and yet turning away from him. And he shows the god looking intently at Ariadne while turning toward her. Now, this parallel of motion away in relation to motion toward would have been called by Titian's contemporaries an example, and a very deft one, of antithesis in Italian contrapposti. She turns away as he turns toward. And so they are antitheses of each other. They are linked as antitheses, linked as contrapposti. Moreover, if you look very carefully at the two figures, you can see that in their pose, they are virtually spitting images of each other, although in reverse direction. She is coiled away from him, and he is coiled toward her. Now, there is a term for this in Italian. The term is figure come fratelli. It literally means figures that appear like brothers to each other, fraternal figures, by which the Italians mean figures that are like mirror images of each other. And this is the way they describe symmetry that plays out not bilaterally, not on a plane, but in 3 dimensions, in space. Spatial symmetry. Now, Titian shows Ariadne as the spatial image of Bacchus, and Bacchus as the spatially symmetrical image of Ariadne, to emphasize that this is the moment of their love. Because in love poetry, we encounter over and over again this trope. Love turns the lover into an image of the beloved, turns the beloved into an image of the lover. And so Titian uses figura come fratelli, 3-dimensional symmetry, to emphasize that. Bacchus and Ariadne's love, as we watch, is converting them into images of each other. So intense is that love. Now, this is a very ingenious reading of Catullus combined with Ovid. And Titian added one additional little gloss to the image, and he found this in Philostratus, a marvelous text by Philostratus called the Imagines, the Images, which consists of ekphrastic images, rhetorically produced, so verbally produced images, descriptions of things and events so powerful that they call up those things and events to one's mind's eye. And one of the things that Philostratus says, that Bacchus's chariot was pulled not by tigers, but by cheetahs. And so Titian depicted a pair of cheetahs pulling the chariot of Bacchus. He glossed all this by a clever little gloss taken from Philostratus. But of course, what Titian is showing you is that he can do something that the poet can't do. It's very difficult for the poet to distinguish between a cheetah and a tiger. But this is something that a pictorial artist, a painter, can do well. So implicitly, Titian is showing, look, I am a poet in paint, and I can do something more vividly even than the poets can do. Well, let's look at another example of a painter reading the classics. This time we're going to go we're going to enter a room. We're going to look at a fresco complex. And this is in the Farnese Palace in Rome. And this is a room that the ceiling of which was painted by Annibale Carracci. And so we're going to be looking at parts of this ceiling. But I wanted you to see the room for which the ceiling was painted, and to keep in mind that in painting the ceiling, Annibale was thinking of a theme, and the theme was the all-conquering power of love. There is no force in the world as powerful as love. And he took this theme from a collection of Greek poems called the Greek Anthology, and in particular, an epigrammatic poem by Philippus that talks about the power of love to conquer all the gods. The power of the gods is nothing compared to the power of love. And he also referred to one of Virgil's most famous poems. This is called an eclogue. It's eclogue number 10, in which Virgil coined the immortal phrase, omnia vincit amor, love conquers all things. Now, the room was a picture gallery. And originally, famous works of ancient sculpture were displayed in the niches. And these were works owned by one of the most powerful families in Rome, the Farnese family. And this is an engraving that shows you what the room looked like in the 17th century, with the magnificent statues still in their niches. And here are two of these statues, and I wanted to show you this detail from the ceiling. In the four corners of the ceiling, we see two, these are called putti, which is P-U-T-T-I. It simply means little boy, but in fact, these little boys are embodiments of love. So one is eros, the embodiment of love, and the other is the embodiment of anteros, reciprocal love. And they appear in all four corners as a way of emphasizing that love is the theme of this fresco complex. Love, reciprocal love. Love is Annibale Carracci's theme. Now, because this room was intended to be a picture gallery, Annibale organized the ceiling into a series of, you see these rectangles that appear to be framed paintings. It's as if he took framed paintings and deposited them in the ceiling. And not only did he use this conceit, that is, what we're looking at in the ceiling is a series of paintings as if assembled there, he also included simulated bronze plaques. You can see them here, there, and everywhere, and simulated stucco statues. And why did he do this? Because it's a museum. And so sculpture was displayed in the niches of the room, and then above, it's as if we have a simulated picture gallery, paintings of paintings. Annibale based his ceiling on the most famous ceiling in Rome, Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. And in passing, I wanted to note that Annibale was emulating Michelangelo, not copying Michelangelo, emulating him, using Michelangelo's pictorial scheme, pictorial organization, not for a sacred subject, but rather for a mythological subject. There's a term for what Annibale was doing, and I won't dwell on these terms, but there are terms for everything he was doing in the ceiling. For example, the term for a simulated painting. A painting of a simulated painting is a quadro riportato, a simulated easel painting, and so on and so forth. There is a vocabulary to describe what it is that Annibale was doing. The center of the ceiling depicts the triumph of Bacchus, who's here shown in his chariot beside the chariot of his consort, Ariadne. Like everything in the ceiling, the triumph is presented satirically. It is, in fact, a mock triumph. It's the triumph of Bacchus, but Bacchus is showing succumbing to the gift of wine that he confers on the world. And so Annibale shows Bacchus drunk and virtually falling out of his chariot. You can see that he can barely sit in his chariot, and he has to be propped up by a satyr. So it's a satirical image of Bacchus undone by his gift of wine. And in the foreground, we see a nymph. And this is a very clever joke by Annibale. The nymph is depicted in the form of a very famous statue of Ariadne. And she is not only drunk, overcome by drink, but she's looking very lasciviously at the figure of Silenus on the donkey's back. And what Annibale is emphasizing is, yes, this is the triumph of Bacchus, but it's a triumph of Bacchus in which the triumphant Bacchus is himself undone by wine, and moreover, the celebrants in this mock triumph succumb to carnal desire. They succumb to love. And as we look at details in the ceiling, we'll see everyone and everything is succumbing to the power of love. So just to remind you again, here is the ceiling. The ceiling consists of simulated paintings. This is the god Pan, who seduces the most chaste. He's one of the least chaste. He's one of the most lascivious of the ancient gods. And he seduces the chaste goddess Diana by offering her a woven cloth, whiter than any woven cloth Diana has ever seen before. And here you see the god Mercury seducing the shepherd Paris into judging a contest between three goddesses. So he's giving him a golden apple and saying, you choose which goddess is the most beautiful. And how does he seduce Paris into doing this? By promising that if he does this, he will receive a desirable reward. Ultimately, this turned out to be Helen of Troy, and this is what set off the Trojan War. But these are both images about seduction, and every image, it turns out, in the fresco exemplifies the power of love. This is, for example, the story of Venus and her mortal lover Anchises. And Annibale took this from Virgil's Aeneid, Book 1, as well as the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. But there's a joke here. The power of love is so great that it turns the hero Anchises into the foot servant of Venus. And the power of love is so great that it causes a goddess to be enamored of a mere mortal, Anchises. Both the goddess is undone by love and the mortal hero is undone by love. And Annibale introduces a clever little joke. This is taken from Virgil's Book 1, whence came the Latin race? from where came the Latin race. And of course, for Virgil, it comes from great heroic deeds and from the intervention of Venus, other gods and goddesses. What is Annibale saying? No, it was just love. It was just carnal love. Venus succumbed to it, and Anchises succumbed to it. Venus then gave birth to a son. That son was Aeneas. He is the progenitor of the Roman race. And so with all of the gods and goddesses. This image is based on two savage satires by Lucian, How to Write History, Dialogues of the Gods, in which he talks about Hercules, the greatest of all the semi-divine heroes, who becomes madly enamored of Iole. This is the woman over here. And she becomes so powerful over Hercules that she appropriates all the attributes of his heroic manhood, his club, his lion skin, and dresses him in her clothes, asks him to play the tambourine for her. So powerful is love. So powerful is love that it makes Jupiter famous for his infidelity to Juno, love his wife. So he's very unfaithful to Juno, but so what does Juno do? And she does this to help the Trojans, who are losing the Trojan War, and she doesn't like this. And so she seduces Jupiter, and while she seduces Jupiter, the Trojans are able to regain the upper hand. The joke here being that love is so powerful, it can even make the unfaithful god Jupiter faithful to his wife Juno. And finally, Diana and Endymion. And here Annibale was referring to another famous lyric poem by Catullus, his 66th Elegy, in which he talks about the power of love. So great is it that when the moon, Diana, falls in love with a shepherd, she leaves her orbit to embrace him. This is how powerful love is. Well, why all of these images about the power of love to assert itself even over gods and goddesses? Because the ceiling, the primary function of the ceiling was to celebrate a great marriage. And at a marriage ceremony, one was expected to recite poetry. This is true of the ancients, and it's true of the Romans in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the poetry was expected to describe love in as bawdy and carnal a way as possible. It was supposed to encourage the new husband and the new wife to procreate. The poem was supposed to be sexy, it was supposed to be bawdy, it was supposed to celebrate the power of carnal love. And this is ultimately what Annibale does. He reads all of these classical texts, assembles them into a series of simulated paintings that celebrate the power of love, and therefore as a whole, function as a marriage poem. And the term for this kind of poem is an epithalamion. Let's look briefly at two further images. This is an image by one of the greatest French painters of the 17th century, Poussin, and he based it on a close reading of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And let me begin by identifying the characters. This is Flora. Remember Flora from Botticelli? Well, this is Flora, the goddess of gardens, verdancy, fertility. She's dancing happily, and her dance is amplified by a dance of erotes, little personifications of love. You can see we're in her garden. Here's her bower, demarcating the boundaries of that garden. In the garden, we see various figures, all taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and these are all figures who died for love and then were transformed into flowers. And so here is Ajax, who was transformed into the carnation. Here is Narcissus, who was transformed into the narcissus. Here is Clytie, who was transformed into the sunflower. Here is Hyacinth, the beloved of Apollo, who was transformed into the hyacinth. Here is Adonis, the beloved of Venus, who was transformed into the anemone. Can you see the anemone? And the anemones are falling from the wound in his thigh. He was gored, he died, and from his blood the anemone sprung. And then finally, here is Crocus and Smilax. And Crocus sort of died for love of Smilax and was turned into the crocus. And then in this cornucopia, this horn of plenty, we see all of the flowers into which these figures were transformed. Now, all of these figures died rather badly. Their deaths were very, very sad. In fact, their deaths were tragic. So why is it that Flora is dancing happily amidst all of these figures? Because Poussin is commenting on Ovid by way of the Neo-Stoic philosophy. There was a great revival of interest in the Stoic philosophers in the 16th and 17th centuries. In fact, this is the second wave of Stoic philosophy. And the Stoics argue that human life is inconstant and transient. The life of nature is constant and everlasting. And therefore, we should order our lives not according to our wishes and desires, but according to the dictates of nature, the dictates of the natural order. Now, Poussin subscribed to the Neo-Stoic philosophy, this moral philosophy. And so he shows how thwarted love is here converted in and through the natural order into the seasonal life of nature, which grows forth each year and then dies each year, but then grows forth again in springtime. In other words, if we accede to the power of the natural order, the power of seasonal change as dictated by the seasons, and we see Apollo, the sun god in the sky, he stands for the ordered change of the seasons in nature and the power of the sun to bring forth new growth from the earth, to bring forth these flowers from the earth. If we accede to the natural order, argues Poussin, in his Neo-Stoic gloss, his Neo-Stoic reading of Ovid, all will be well, for death will be transformed back into life. From the blood of these tragic lovers comes forth every spring the flowers that eternally, in and through the natural order, commemorate them. And one final image, to be honest, this is my favorite. I need to tell you about this picture. It's 2 times life size. And when you go to the Prado in Madrid, where this picture is hanging, and you walk into the room, you're virtually blown away by this picture. It's so overpowering. And these 3 women seem to be so present, so powerful, so forceful, and yet these are the 3 graces. This is Rubens's version of the 3 graces we saw earlier in Botticelli's painting. And what was Rubens doing here? He was reading closely. Rubens was one of the most literate of all painters. He was famed for his learning. He was called a pictor doctus, a learned painter. And he loved Horace. He actually says this in his letters. There's virtually nothing he loves more than the odes of Horace. And he, when designing his picture of the 3 graces, noticed how they are described in 2 of Horace's odes. And he noticed something that no other painter had noticed, that Horace describes them as immensely large and immensely powerful female divinities. And what Horace says is, it is the graces who change winter into spring by performing a dance that consists simply of the stamping of their feet. And Horace also tells us that when they perform this dance, this stamping dance, they link arms. They are linked like a chain. And so Rubens shows them arm in arm, and he shows this stamping dance. And he shows them immense, giant, overpowering, because it is the force of that dance that, according to Horace, cracks the ice of winter open, melts the snows, the vibrations of this dance, the earthquake induced by the Graces is what forces winter to become spring. And this is what Rubens is showing, the change of winter to spring. Now, in showing the change of winter to spring, in narrating it by reference to Horace's description of the dance of the Graces, he was completely transforming the standard depiction of the three Graces as perfectly balanced and yet perfectly still. Botticelli is the odd man out. Rubens is the odd man out. This is the way the Graces were generally depicted. This is a famous painting by Raphael, this a famous fragment of ancient sculpture, probably consulted by Raphael. Perfectly balanced, the one with the other, but still. Botticelli, like Rubens, sets them in motion, and he sets them in motion in response to ancient poetry, ancient descriptions of the three Graces. In doing this, he was painting a mythic version of a subject beloved amongst his contemporaries. The subject was seasonal change. In the Low Countries, where Rubens was based, he was based in Antwerp, which is now in Belgium. In the Low Countries, this is how the four seasons were depicted, as a series of landscape panoramas showing the labor and leisure activities typical of that time of year. And this is one of the greatest of these panoramic landscape friezes by Peter Bruegel. This is the way the seasons generally were shown in the North. This is how Rubens shows the seasons. His depiction of the seasons is based on his reading of the classics, a transformative reading of the classics that is generative of a pictorial poem. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.